was, one of the things that is awesome about it are the longer essays, and I really love some of the introductions to the recipes. And I was going to bring up banana flops. And I know that I just wanted to ask you maybe about some of the longer things that you wrote for the book. Because you had like the I'm vegan because I'm selfish. I like your homebrew section, and then also your introduction to the recipe for cooking dried beans. Those were three of those. Yeah.
I think that I'm not sure I entirely have those politics that now that I have them, but those politics came out of a politics that tried to. Well, one politics I do share is when I was studying in college, the debates between altruism and selfishness, and how silly those debates were. And so that kind of influenced the I'm vegan because I'm selfish argument to try to upset that distinction. And I still think that's basically right. But I think we had a vision of do it yourself that meant like consume less, kind of small is beautiful, and do it yourself, fuck the system, fuck the state, etc. A lot of which I'm still sympathetic to, but I think we didn't really recognize the systemic nature of capitalism and how simply changing one's consumption patterns is not sufficient at all. But I think we put way too much weight on that. And my beer recipe is a classic example of that. But at least it's sort of funny. I don't think the beer came out very good. When I moved to Minneapolis, I realized how shitty my homebrew was, and I stopped making it because people in Minneapolis could really make killer homebrew.
Yeah.
And so and also I could buy really good beer. See, the other reason I made that recipe and started making my own beer is because back then you couldn't get decent beer, believe it or not, and at least not that I could afford. But you couldn't get. So I just did it to make good beer. But as soon as I got to Minneapolis, I realized that there was easy to get good beer pretty cheap. So I gave that up, and my beer sucked. But you can see the politics there was kind of focused, I think, too narrowly on consumption habits. So that's kind of what was motivating us. But we were radical environmentalists and green and interested in that. But again, trying to find individual solutions rather than what I think is necessary now, more systemic solutions.
So individual versus systemic. And that's actually something that's coming up a lot right now in the food studies debates, because we have this move towards and I don't want to get into it too much but this is something that is coming up a lot. We'll just leave it at that for right now, because I don't want to influence.
Yeah, and I think the whole when people call it the slow food movement or the uncooked movement, I think it's wrong to call those things movements. Those aren't movements. Those are trends. Those are fads. They may be productive. They may be useful things to do and ways to cook and ways to consume. Fine, but don't call them movements, because they're not engaged in struggle. They're not engaged in fighting the powers that be. They're engaged in finding alternatives to the powers that be, which is the problem with my homebrew recipe. Right? It's not nothing. Brewing my own homebrew does not threaten Coors in any way. It's cool, and I enjoyed it, and fuck Coors, but I shouldn't pretend that it was a challenge to Coors or to the brewing industry, and I think that a lot of the foodie stuff these days seems to me to pretend it's really a movement, when again, if you're not challenging the powers that be, you're a trend, you're not a movement, and just call it that and be satisfied with it.
Yeah. No, I don't want to go into it too much on my stuff, because I want to interview you before I put my opinions but I definitely agree. Yeah, So I guess and once again, this is kind of leading me into some of the other questions. And so I guess, I'm, obviously at the time that you wrote Soy Not Oi, you were vegan, correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I guess one of my questions, are you still vegetarian or vegan now?
I'm still vegetarian. I'm not vegan.
Okay. And what were some of the main reasons that prompted you to become vegetarian and then vegan? And then also, why do you continue to be a vegetarian?
Yeah, that's good. Well, I was won over by the arguments. I think the arguments against the animal cruelty argument, and especially the environmental the environmental impact arguments of just 9 times worth of grain used to produce 1 pound of beef and, you know, that kind of stuff. I was persuaded by those, and that kind of literature was everywhere in the punk scene, and you couldn't go anywhere without seeing animal rights literature, and I was very influenced by that. And then as I became interested in radical environmentalism and Earth First and stuff like that, it was easy to run into those arguments there as well. So I think Jack and I were motivated by the moral reasons, and so ethical moral reasons and environmental reasons, and so we were vegetarian for a year when we first lived together, and then we went vegan after that first year, and I was vegan for 5 years. A couple of years after I moved to Minneapolis, I was still vegan for a while, and when I fell off the vegan wagon was practical reason and a political reason, although I think the arguments are still correct, essentially. I think the arguments, it's hard to argue with the fact that a vegan diet, if more people ate a vegan diet, there'd be less environmental resources consumed and destroyed. I think that's just true. And the argument, the distinction between vegetarian and vegan is really a false one, because the production of dairy requires the murder of cows and things like that, of cattle, as far as I understand. So I think the distinction is kind of false. But what led me off the wagon was in '93. I was in a punk band called Pissed, and we were touring Europe. And when I was in '91, Audrey, my wife, and I, we right after Soy Not Oi, and then I graduated college, and then I had a few months before we went to grad school, moved to Minneapolis grad school. Yeah. We did the 2-month backpack Europe thing, and it was super hard to be vegan in Europe at that time. It was virtually impossible. And I heard that Chumbawamba, when they left England and toured the rest of Europe, they went vegetarian instead of vegan. So I did that, and it was actually a lifesaver, because I couldn't, in Greece and Italy and stuff, it was fucking impossible unless I ate ratatouille every day. So I ate ratatouille half the time and pizza the other half the time, basically. So in '93, when Piss was going to tour, I'm like, well, shit, I'm going back to vegetarian, because I know how hard it is to be vegan in Europe. And then, of course, by then, everything had changed. It was totally easy to be vegan. But I'd already had my mindset, I'm going to eat some cheese. And I kind of fell off the wagon after that, never went back. And also, I think the political reason is there's a lot of moralism in the animal rights and vegetarian and vegan scenes I was at a party once, and this guy comes to our house, and he was relatively new, and his name was Joe, and he was in he's in the radical Chicano group Mecha, and he comes to our party, and he brings a plate of chicken enchiladas, and like, what a wonderful gift, and of course, pretty much no one at the party was meat eaters, or very few. Yeah. But so I took it and said, thank you very much for that. But I'm sure I kind of have a curled up look on my face. But then one of my roommates came up and looked at me and just looked at the plate and said, ew, chicken, and walked away right in front of Joe. And I was like, what kind of fucking moralistic bullshit is this kind of politics? Right. And then another time, I was in, this is me '92, I guess, and I was with some buddies of mine from Minneapolis that had driven to Vancouver to visit a guy named Gord Hill, another punk rock buddy. And Gord, so we're sitting in Gord's apartment, and his roommate had just got out of prison like a few months ago, maybe even less. And he was watching TV, and he was watching some show about how much millions of dollars they're trying to save this whale who'd been beached. And so all the effort and how wonderful these people were to save the whale, and et cetera, and how many millions of dollars, $100,000 being spent. And the dude just looked at was watching it. He just looked at it and shook his head, and he goes, you people got your priorities all fucked up, And when I heard that coming from an ex-prisoner, I was like, damned if he's not right, that the priorities aren't all fucked up, that all that money gets spent on a whale and not on humanity. And so a lot of the speciesism arguments went out the window for me. I'm still vegetarian because I think meat is fucking disgusting. It tastes gross. So I'm living in Spain right now. In Spain, it's super hard to be vegetarian, and so and my kids, I got 3 kids, and they'll eat meat. So occasionally I'll try what they've got, or it's, like I said, it's super hard when you're out in Spain, and So I'll like take a bite of whatever they've got or something. It's gross, man. I have no desire to eat it. So I've just lost the taste.
Yeah.
And I think the argument's